Okay, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Senate House at the University of London. My name is Corinne Lennox. I'm a senior lecturer in human rights here and co-director of the Human Rights Consortium, which is co-sponsoring today. I have another hat that I wear today, which is as chair of the Dalit Solidarity Network UK, which is also hosting today's event. And we're pleased to come together at the end of a 6-month, very intensive project to try and look more intensively at how we can support businesses to bring attention to caste-based discrimination in their operations, both in the UK and in their supply chains. And we're going to hear a little bit more today about some of the findings and a bit of research we did about that. We hosted the first training of its kind on caste and discrimination, caste-based discrimination of businesses in the UK last week here at Senate House. We're going to share with you some findings from that. But we're very pleased to be able to also welcome an esteemed panel to share with you their insights on this topic. Of course, caste-based discrimination is a root cause of many of the most serious forms of labor rights and human rights violations, from forced labor and bonded labor and child labor, all the way up to issues in relation to fair working conditions, equality in hiring, protection from sexual harassment in the workplace, experiencing access to decent work, etc. And we found, based on our research and the research of others, it's an issue in the UK, but also in, of course, South Asia, which is going to be the main focus of our talk today. The project was led by the Dalit Solidarity Network in consultation with the Human Rights Consortium, and we're grateful to the University of London for a knowledge exchange grant to enable us to do this pilot work. We're very pleased also to be working with the Ethical Trading Initiative, which is represented today by Peter McAllister, the Executive Director, by the International Dalit Solidarity Network, also represented today by the Executive Director, Meena Varma, welcome Meena, and the National Campaign of Dalit Human Rights, which is based in India, for which Manjula has a strong association as well, and I'll introduce her in a moment. So we'll take about an hour and a half. We'll hear from our 3 speakers. We have a short film clip to show as well, and hopefully have time for some discussion. And please join us for a short reception afterwards, particularly for those of you who are staying for the film. So allow me just to introduce our 3 speakers briefly. So we have Ghazala Sheikh, who is the director of DSN UK since early 2022. She has over 2 decades of experience in international humanitarian and development sectors in South and Central Asia, where she's focused on issues of equitable development, social justice, access to natural resources, and gender-based development for the most marginalized communities. She's held previous leadership positions with institutions like Development Alternatives, the Center for Environment Education, and most recently with Mercy Corps in Tajikistan. Next to her is Manjula Pradi, who is a human rights activist working for the rights of marginalized communities, especially Dalits and women, for more than 3 decades. She was previously director of the Navsarjan Trust, which is a leading one of the largest Dalit rights organizations in India. She's also a former chair of the International Dalit Solidarity Network, and has been representing the issues of Dalit rights, and in particular Dalit women at the UN, at the European Parliament, and in other important spaces where she's been a significant advocate for decades. She has taken up cases of extreme forms of violence and atrocities against women and Dalits, and in particular sexual violence of minor girls and women from marginalized communities. She is the founder of Wise Active Youth Visioning and Engagement, WAVE, is that how you pronounce it? Foundation, whose mission it is to transform the lives of grassroots women activists and youth leaders from marginalized communities. She's also the director of campaigns at the Dalit Human Rights Defenders Network. And among the many accolades that she has earned for her leadership, she was also last year listed by BBC as one of the 100 most influential and inspirational women for the world. So that's a pretty good accolade and well-deserved. Welcome, Manjula. And finally, we have Peter McAllister, who is Executive Director of the Ethical Trading Initiative. He spent more than 20 years engaged in international development and rights-based initiatives around the world. He joined ETI in 2010 after spending 7 years at the Geneva-based International Cocoa Initiative, which brings together global companies involved in cocoa and chocolate, trade unions and NGOs to eliminate the world's worst forms of child labor and forced labor in that industry. And previously, he spent 13 years working in leadership roles for international development NGO CARE, including taking on strategic roles in India and West and Southern Africa. Welcome, Peter. So with that, I'd like to hand over for some opening words from Manjula. You have the floor.
Good evening, friends. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be part of this event, and I thank DSN UK, Meena as well, for Corinne, Ghazala, and all my supporters here. There are some of them sitting here for organizing the two events. So this one is equally important for me as well. And I was telling to Ghazala that my expertise as such is not on business and human rights, but I did try to do my preparation for that. So can I do it now?
Please.
Okay. Yeah. So I think since my 3 decades of work, I feel that corporate human rights needs due diligence, which is picking up pace globally as well. But in the context of India, I would like to make few of my reflections. As we attempt to address the converging effects of the COVID-19, as we know what happened during the pandemic, the climate crisis and vulnerabilities in our increasingly interconnected and interdependent global economies, making from region to region more difficult, and in terms of what the impact of that crisis to a country like India. As such, United Nations have its own guiding principles on business and human rights, and with them a commitment to corporate human rights due diligence is increasingly on the agenda, and that includes India as well. I think what I would like to bring up to the fact is that it is becoming increasingly important that companies' actions to protect and respect human rights extend beyond their home country to all regions where it manufactures, sources, and sells its products and services. I come from Gujarat, where the Prime Minister state is, and it's one of the industrialized states in the country. So I would also speak about my own experience on these issues. Protection of human rights across supply chains is also one of the key principles in UNGPs. And global companies which either operate in India or are linked to India through their manufacturing and supply chains must follow both the law of both their home countries, and laws and regulations should be applicable in our country as well. India has several local laws and regulations which aim to ensure protection of and respect for human rights. Central and state level remedy mechanisms are available in the country for those affected by human rights violations. Being an advocate, I do know what are the issues relating to those who are working in the unorganized sector, which I will come later. I just want to bring into fact that the social protection, occupational health and safety, unionization and collective bargaining remain a challenge in general, but particularly for informal workers. My journey in Gujarat started with working on the issue of minimum wages for agricultural laborers. Despite we having so many factories across the state, I was working in a particular region called a district called Baroda, and there I realized that the minimum wages were not paid. As such, the first law which came up in the country was by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the former law minister of India. And the minimum wage rate in Gujarat at that time in '95, when I started organizing them, was just 34 rupees. And people who were paid, specifically Dalits, Adivasis, were paid just 6 to 12 rupees a day. So I started organizing them. I formed a union of agricultural laborers and body laborers. And I just want to lay forward that later on, when I organized a protest on this issue, I also had a rally, and my office was attacked by the landlords who are with the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the right-wing party. So that was my difficult experience, and that happened in 1999. So as such, India always talks about rapid economic growth and development, but I was also involved with the issue of manual scavenging, where people are forced to do cleaning of human excrements with bare hands. Since '96, we were there organizing the people who were affected by this issue, which is very inhuman. And there was a village called Ranpur, where the village panchayat, the village council, was paying 5 rupees a month. And when 40 women from the scavenging community requested that they be given brooms to clean the toilet, the dry toilets, the panchayat said, we don't have money for that, we don't have budget for it. and we organized them, and we also came to know that the law which was enacted in 1993 to prohibit this practice was not enacted in our state. So we filed a public interest litigation, and then the law was enacted in 2000 in the urban areas and in 2001 in the rural areas. But the fact is that still mechanization has not happened. There is no rapid development on this issue. Still people are dying of manhole deaths. And recently, like I am here, in 1 week back only, there were 2 manhole workers who died in Gujarat. So this is the sad state of our country. And we talk about total sanitation drive, and we talk about various things, but I think the mechanization is one of the main issue in India with regard to cleaning of human excrement. In India, an estimated 11.7 million people, this is our 2013 figures, are into bonded labor. I think communities who are mainly marginalized are displaced because of this issue as well. There is a lot of internal displacement. And during the COVID times, I was helping the migrant workers across the country by setting up a helpline. And the name of the helpline was Relief and Aid Helpline. And we tried to help as many workers from the poor states in India, such as Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, who had migrated from their source to our place like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. And it was very difficult for us to help them because the system, the mechanism it needs, the factory should have to provide them that safe place, because they were in vulnerable situation. Where would they get medical aid? Where if they get affected by COVID, right? So I realized what happens to, as you know, you must have read in the news also how the migrant women, how difficult for them was if they are lactating mothers. It was very difficult time. We tried our best through support of some of our organizations. One of them is sitting with here also, like Marivara Health Initiative. They gave us a support which we also helped them to provide them ration kits, as well we also supported them to provide them travel support so that they can go back to their homes. But it wasn't so easy. How I am saying it's the reality was much difficult for us to do. Child labor, I worked on this issue in India, and child labor is in all work, in the sense manual scavenging. I have seen Dalit children dragging dead animals in the villages. I have seen them dragging dead dogs or cats, and these children, they are dropped off from the schools, right? I've also seen the tribal children who are in the schools. They are forced to do the menial work by the teachers in the school. So these challenges and these issues are never coming on the surface. They are always underlined because people don't think that these are serious issues, and it impacts their health. There is a lot of malnutrition in India, and there is a lot of maternity mortality in India. If you see the UN report that a Dalit woman dies 14.6 years lesser than any other gender woman in India. So that's a serious issue. There is a serious issue because Gujarat also is known for drug companies, right? So I live in Ahmedabad. From Ahmedabad, there are so many drug companies, and there is clinical trials happening. I have personally seen it, witnessed it, and majority of the clinical trials, and there are a lot of UK companies as well, and a lot of Dalits, young Dalit youth, are those who are unemployed, are trapped into it. So like drugs like for diabetes, for high blood pressure, all these ailments, they are being used as guinea pigs. Leather industry, I want to show that film if it's possible now, because I have been handling a case of flogging of 4 Dalit youth by cow vigilantes in India. I'll just show you and then I'll talk about it. It's 6 minutes, I'll show you about this. So this is all the leather tanning areas. So this is a part of Gujarat. And these are all dead animals which are brought for skinning.
તમારું નામ શું? આખું નામ બોલો. એમને ગમે શું કહેતા હતા ગૌ માસ ખાવાની પરમિટ છે તમને? ધંધાની પરમિટ? મારા ચિંતા ને પરમતભાઈ
ત્યારે એ લોકો અમે ગાય સીતા હતા ને ત્યારે એ લોકો આવી અને સીધા લગભગ એમ માનો કે કરી ગાડી હતી અને બે પડ્યું અને એ લોકો આવીને સીધા મારવા જ મળ્યા એટલે 1.5 કલાક મારા છોકરાઓને લઈને
મારા પપ્પાનું નામ રામા દેવા, રામજીભાઈ દેવા, મારા દાદાનું નામ દેવાભાઈ રાજા. અમે 3 પેઢીથી કામ કર્યું છે અને અત્યારે અમે સરકાર શ્રીને લડીને આ જમીન અમને આપી એટલે અમે આ કામ કર્યું છે.
So I just want to, I come from this community, my parents. So I just wanted to let you know that leather industry is one of the main industries in India, but the ownership of the industrialization of the leather is by the dominant caste, and it's also been shown in one of our films called India Untouched. And this incident which you saw moved me a lot because this was in 2016 when I was leading that organization. So we are still fighting the case, defending the case. It's in the last stage of judgment, hopefully, but the judgment should have come within 2 months of the incident in 2016. Now we are in 2023. I just want to lay forward that leather industry, how does because there's so much of work to be done. India is one of the largest exporter of beef at one time, and still I think they are. But now there is a ban on cow slaughter, and so I just wanted to focus on it. So I want to end with saying that there are legal frameworks which are present, but the most important aspect in India is about the implementation. We have been working a lot on the issues of implementation of several laws in India. So opportunities for strengthening relation and cooperation among CSOs and business are not explored daily. Although we have few exceptions such as Marivara Health Initiative, with whom I have been working since last 3 years. Azim Premji Philanthropy Initiatives is there, Wipro Foundation, Tata Trust, Dasra Network, and few more. There's another organization, HCF, which supported me at the time when I was struggling to exist and to do my work in India. So MHI has played a very important role because we all see CSR with one lens of that they are not focusing on the human rights aspect. I think what they have come up with is the entire aspect of mental health. And we are working very closely on that issue with those the activists who are doing this grassroots activism and how their mental health is impacted. So we focus on that through the support from MHI, and I also try to build a leadership of grassroots women activists in 11 states at the moment in the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mandela, for that really helpful overview of some of the ways that caste discrimination is manifesting in different aspects of labor, and also how the existing structures of inequality created by caste are replicated in the workplace in terms of who has power and who doesn't. And you illustrated that very well also with the short film. But good to hear that CSOs are working together to try and provide support to those who are defending rights of laborers in that context. So on that note, I'm going to invite Peter to say a few words from the perspective of ETI, which of course has been working on these issues at a meta level, so to speak, but also in relation to caste. So please, Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share our experience. I'm not an expert on caste, I'm not an expert on dialects, and it's really inspiring to hear the work that you do. So we come at it from a different angle, that global supply chains now present in many, if not most, of the countries in the world, and that generally consumers and to a lesser extent governments think that brands and retailers have a responsibility for their supply chains. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's evolving. But largely they're blind to caste. So if you look at most companies that source or engage with Southeast Asia, and you ask them about salient risk, caste hardly ever appears. So there's still a big job to do just to raise this level of awareness. And for those of you who know more than I do, it's hides in plain sight, as you all know. This isn't a secret, it goes on everywhere. It's to a large extent the challenge is because the caste system is rather accepted rather than challenged that we have what we face. So I'll talk you through some of the work we do and the approaches. We don't reach very deep into the lower tiers of the supply chain like Tannery. Typically we're dealing with first and second tier, but we have to start somewhere. You will know that most companies have some sort of public code or statements on their website about climate, about human rights, and that's not a bad start point, but largely those are very much at the superficial level, and it's really important to engage companies in how does that play out in practice, what does that mean? More often than not, you'll get an answer which relates to compliance. What compliance means is that they will typically have social auditors visiting a workspace maybe once a year, typically announced, and they'll make a judgment on various things, and they'll come back and have a tick box exercise. Those things, though, that mechanism is largely useless at detecting things like gender-based violence, abuse of particular minority groups, bonded labour, and so on and so forth. All the things we know that are coincident with, certainly with Dalits and the caste system. So the overarching model that companies use, and there are hundreds of millions of dollars a year spent on this, largely covers up the thing that we're trying to expose. However, with the UN Guiding Principles, which was launched in 2011, which is really a paradigm shift, and more recently with the move towards mandatory human rights due diligence, sorry, that's quite a mouthful. So you see this in France, you see it in Germany, you see it in Norway, and the directive in the EU we hope will land sometime this year or next year, making it a requirement that companies actually start to understand their human rights impact, which, if done properly, should be a change from a compliance approach. So crudely, if you like, compliance is hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. And a human rights due diligence approach, if done properly, should be what do I know about what's happening and what do I understand about underlying causes. The rights that are appropriate are all the ones that we know. There's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there's a whole range of ILO conventions, I think it's 197 now, there's a basic human rights convention. So all the essential rights are encapsulated in that duty of the company to understand and respect rights. I'm supposed to do this as I go along, apologies. At the risk of being controversial, the reality for most companies is they are not engaged in this for the good of the world, and they are confronted with a whole range of demands, certainly if you're in the sort of C-suite. And what motivates companies to get engaged is a limited number of things in my experience. It's either, can we make more money out of it? Is it innovative, which ends up being about the money? Is it about regulation? Do I comply with the law? Do I need to comply with the law? Will it affect my reputation? So it's risk around reputation. That's it. Now, unless we therefore can engage a business on one or more of these things, the chances are we're going to end up in the CSR department. And the CSR department is largely about doing certain things because that looks good and because that's what companies are asked many times by NGOs and people to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is not getting to these embedded human rights issues. So how do we make sure that when we're talking about caste, and we'll talk about how that plays out in a minute, that we're intersecting that with that as a risk to business? Hopefully in the future, if you want to comply with regulation, you need to understand caste and how this plays out through the supply chains. That's a more meaningful conversation with the business than it would be nice if you could do it, or it would be better if you followed the following things. The role then of projects and then interventions are about how you then mitigate that risk, how you then use that experience to talk about it. They're not in and of themselves as solutions, they're helping to engage business and use that platform then to inform the wider debate, I would argue. And of course, vulnerable groups are always at risk, and there's a very small list of different ways of looking at vulnerability. But if you're a Dalit woman, you have an intersectional relationship. You're a woman, you're a Dalit. You're probably vulnerable because you're a migrant. There's a whole range of vulnerabilities that play out that make caste and Dalits in particular excessively vulnerable in situations. And as we've already heard, more often than not, you're being asked to do the dirty and difficult jobs that people don't want to do and don't want to be associated with. Nobody wants to go down the drain.
Yeah.
Not I've ever met anyway. So we need to acknowledge that we need to align the conversation with what will get a company engaged. And in this case, it's going to be both to comply with regulation on HRDD, and secondly, about reputational risk if you don't get it right. So as there is that direction of travel along human rights risk and human rights impacts, trying to surface the idea that caste is one of the things you've got to understand because it's one of the underlying causes of vulnerability and risk that you're going to see, particularly in Southeast Asia, but not alone, as you rightly point out. It's also in our country, sadly. And as I said earlier on, it's too often for foreigners a completely invisible aspect. I've lived in India for 3 or 4 years, I've travelled to India multiple times, and I make no great claims, other than it's an amazing country, to have that sensitivity, other than interacting with people and getting some knowledge. You know that it's present. I mean, laughingly, it's present in advertisements for marriages. If you go back to the days when that was in the back of the newspapers at the weekend, all by the subtle use of words and language and what have you. So it's a feature of life for everybody. Most CSR professionals, and certainly most foreigners, would be oblivious to all of that. So trying to get people to acknowledge that this is, like gender, one of the vulnerabilities that you're faced with is quite an important first step. So this is all about understanding root causes. It's very easy to look at the symptoms of a situation and want to fix the symptoms. Unless you actually walk back and understand the root causes, at best you may not identify those who are affected, you may actually not address the symptoms, not address the causes at all. You may have a limited impact, which then reverts back to the norm. And in fact, you could further discrimination, because typically we find, again, I'm looking at a conversation today, when trying to unpack something that's happening in a garment factory in southern India, the initial interaction with the workers showed that they were being coached. And because they are the problem in that context, not actually finding out what's going on. So you have to be really careful as you start to engage in the real world in terms of how we do something. And of course, it's not an easy and it's not an uncontroversial subject. There are plenty of people who benefit from the system as it is, and plenty of people who think, well, that's how it's always been, and that's therefore how it always should be. So you're having to engage in entrenched attitudes and entrenched practices and entrenched groups, which makes it very difficult indeed. Now, the way we engage with this is we're not politically active. We're looking at the workplace. So partly our job's slightly easier because we're not engaged in that wider political debate, and we'll argue whether that's the right approach or not. But in the workplace, what we're trying to do is to say, particularly with the value chain, if these things are happening, to what extent are you understanding the caste as an underlying factor? And therefore, in terms of engaging in solutions, are you factoring in raising awareness or making sure groups are genuinely heard? Again, I would guess that most times that workers are put forward to talk, they won't be Dalits. There will be workers that management and supervisors feel comfortable talking to auditors, for example. So what can you do if you're a company? The first thing is all about starting understanding what is caste and how this plays out. As I say, there is a large amount of ignorance, certainly in foreign populations, but even talking to Indians based in India, for example, the reluctance of middle-class Indians to acknowledge this as potentially an issue. And I have good friends there, and they will after a while say, look, we don't know how to tackle this. This is so embedded in our way of thinking, we don't even have this conversation in the office. And these are the good guys, these are the CSR professionals and so forth. So we've got a lot of work to do just to raise this as something that needs to be taken and understood by business. And therefore you start to create a policy environment in which you legitimise talking about this, you legitimise understanding how we reach Dalits and how do we make sure their voices are heard and so forth. But if you don't start there, the chances are, at best, efforts will fizzle out, or in fact, they won't go anywhere. Second, and really important, is business needs to partner with those who actually understand how to access Dalit communities, how to understand how caste plays out in the context, how to give really good practical advice. And again, in a non-political sense, which is not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, but how does this play out practically in the workplace so that if you like, when speaking to your customer, you're meeting their expectations. So we can use international leverage at brands and retailers, once we've got them on board, to start to drive better practices. And if you like, the same way we would have an inclusion and diversity conversation here, like that plays out in this context as well. So through international networks, but also through local expertise, understanding how this plays out in context. I'll give you an example. We're doing a human rights impact assessment for a big group in India. We firstly had to coach the brands, and not only was what was happening, because they were fairly aware of that, why it might be happening. There's a lot of migrant data workers in this group in southern India, I think from places like Orissa, UP possibly, and then why we would want to have a caste lens on part of the assessment so that we can unpick this. And that was quite a challenge, just to get that acknowledgement that this was one aspect of the human rights impact assessment. We did have their attention because reputational risk, so we had a focus. And then it was about working with a partner in India, an Indian partner in India that really understood this and could balance off the sensitivities of trying to understand and unearth the caste issues while not necessarily making that the headline approach. We were looking at working conditions, health and safety, discrimination and so forth, but knowing that caste might be playing out through this. And then there are some resources, probably not enough use of those and feedback to people like us. I can't remember when we did our work, 18, 19, something like that. 18. And I mean, it's a good piece of work, but all our tools, talking as ETI, they always get better when people try and use them and come back and say, this didn't work, or this didn't go far enough, or could you give us more advice on that? So I'm probably saying well welcome in terms of time, but we will get there. There is a role for business in wider policy, and I think that's often led by others. Finding the opportunities where we build confidence and companies can speak up in a way where they're talking about it in a responsible business environment, so that the legal and policy environment is helping them achieve responsible business objectives, because that's what their shareholders want, that's what their customers want, and that's what people like us are asking for. So we have to be, in most cases, aware that they are not going to lead the political charge, but they can be a support to political positions around trade agreements, for example, if we align that with responsible business and levelling the playing field. So it's not just a few that are trying to do the good work, but actually saying that everybody should be implicated. So that's really my thoughts on business and human rights. Happy to answer questions later on. But don't underestimate how difficult this is, both in terms of raising the issue in the first place, getting people on board, whether that's an international headquarters or in a regional office, and then working sensitively through the workspace so that you don't end up making the situation worse for those that you're actually trying to sort of help by making sure that their rights are respected and also implemented. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those thoughts, Peter, from the wider experience of ETI, and it's helpful to know that some of the new instruments that are coming through, like the human rights due diligence, can be used to pick up some of these issues. But where there's a reluctance to talk about them, we need to we need to ask those questions in the first place. And I think for companies from the UK, they can play that role in asking those questions, to start getting the conversation going and empowering local actors like that Manjula works with to carry that forward as well. And just to say, the copy of the guidance that Peter mentioned and that Nina was the author on, it's just at the back of the room, so please do take a copy of that before you leave, because it's a really valuable tool, and do let us know how useful it is for your work. Finally, let me invite Ghazala Sheikh to share some reflections on what we've been learning in this project for the last 6 months or so. I'll just bring up your slides. You want to sit here?
I'll stand here.
Okay.
That presentation.
Please.
No, I'm fine. Yeah. So finally, I just like to share with you some of our experience in the project that we had undertaken. It was a very short project of about 6 months, and we looked in terms of how do we kind of work or engage with businesses on addressing caste discrimination in workplace as well as in supply chain. Are we there? Sorry. As Manjula also highlighted and Peter mentioned, these are some of the kind of key issues which you see with on caste discrimination that exist in countries like India, Pakistan, and it's just not an Indian issue. When you talk about caste, it's an issue which is prevalent in all the South Asian countries or wherever South Asians are. So you see it happening everywhere. So you just can't be saying that this is an issue of India, but it is an issue which is there in Nepal, it is there in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, so all these places, and wherever there is a diaspora population, right? So even within UK and other places, you would have issues around caste discrimination. In terms of, if you look at some of the key sectors where you see a lot of, where you see caste discrimination, you see bonded labor, or you see these kind of, slavery issues, some of them like, leather, which Manjula did talk about, in terms of, from tanning, skinning to tanning to, different places. And interestingly, if you look at it, leather has always been a caste issue, a caste related, vocation, right? When you talk about leather, and that is where there are a lot of casteist slurs and casteist words which are used for people who are engaged in leather industries, right? So that is one issue. In carpets, you see a lot of child labor which is involved. And most of the child labor, if you see, belongs to our caste-affected, people who, children who work in these carpets. In agriculture, you see, as Manjula mentioned, that agriculture has one of the largest level of bonded labor and child labor which is involved. In stones and minerals and in brick kilns, so these are some sectors which are where you see, which is very, it's a very visual impact of caste that you can kind of see over here. And as I mentioned that when you talk about caste, that caste also exists even within diaspora, right? So if you look at in terms of that. You see open caste discrimination where people hide their caste. They do not really say what caste they are in fear of retaliation. So if you have in your workplace, if you have a person who belongs to a Dalit community or who is a Dalit, would not really say openly that they are Dalits. It's because in terms of a fear of retaliation that it may hinder that person's growth prospects, may result into kind of verbal and other abuses that the person may be faced with. One of the things that you see that the human resources in diaspora, they do not really have the competency to understand caste because it's such a it's such an entrenched aspect into the lives of South Asian population that it becomes very difficult for them to also understand. And if you look at in the UK, because you do not have it defined as a caste as one of the protected characteristics, it becomes much more difficult for human resource to actually implement or to look in terms of caste in workplace. And it also, and that results also into difficult for people facing discrimination to come up with make complaints, and for even if they make complaints, for those complaints to lead to any kind of disciplinary action is something that because it is hindered in that sense. One of the things which you would see a lot of higher caste people in the diaspora, referring to, one of the things is that they are less educated or equated in terms of that one. The second is like people coming from India would also be talking about oh, this person has come here because of reservation, like has studied in India, because the affirmative action in India is taken something as a negative aspect rather than in promoting equity in that sense, right? There have been some cases, in terms of, in the UK, in US, where there have been caste discrimination that have happened. If you look at the first case, which is at household level, where a person of a higher caste employed a person of a lower caste, and there were issues around, salary compensation in terms of, confinement of the person and others in terms of that. So there was one case which happened in the UK. Then there have been even cases in companies, in workplace, where discrimination has been practiced, especially if you look in the IT sector. Because you have so much of population which comes from South Asia. So there you see a lot of discrimination that is being practiced. So there have been cases around that, and considering those aspects, there have been companies like Apple and Dell, they have tried to incorporate caste into their equality and diversity policies and all. But this is, there are very few, you can name companies on your fingertips, who have tried to incorporate. You need to have more companies coming out proactively and incorporating these aspects of that. Now coming to the project, this was a very short duration project which we had for about 6 months, and the aim was basically to support businesses in the UK one is to understand and then look in terms of mechanisms for prevention of caste-based discrimination in the workplace and in the supply chain. And as Corinne mentioned, the partners that we worked with Ethical Trading Initiatives, with IDSN, with Corinne and Human Rights Consortium, and with NCDHR in India. And this was supported by the University of London's Knowledge Exchange Fund. Now, when you look at some of the activities that we carried out, we did a short survey and we did a webinar with businesses who have, company members of ETI. Basically, because we worked with them on this, so we did a short survey with them. Then we did a half-a-day training with businesses on understanding caste-based discrimination and approaches to caste-based discrimination in the workplace and in supply chain. We did that, and today we are talking about, we're disseminating some of our learnings from those, from the project that we had. In the webinar and the survey, we had about 21 participants from 14 businesses who participated in it. And one of the main sectors who participated in the whole exercise, they were mainly from apparel and textiles, and who had their supply chain either in India or in Bangladesh. So their interest in terms of looking at addressing caste discrimination in the supply chain was very apparent in that. We did have some other sectors as well, like food and agriculture, stone, minerals, and media and marketing, who participated in some of these activities. In terms of when we talked about the webinar was basically an orientation to what is caste discrimination that we had, and it was a 2 hour it was approximately a 2 hour session that we had. And from that, the companies did they showed an interest in terms of understanding existing practices or actions that they could look in terms of addressing caste discrimination in businesses, especially in the supply chain. They were more, because as I did mention that most of the companies who participated in our activities had their interest in supply chain also. So in terms of that, they also felt, they were very uncertain about, and Manjula and and Peter did mention about, that this being a very sensitive issue in terms of, when you're talking about caste with supply, around that. So they are very, so this needs to be handled with a lot of care, because it can cut both ways. If you do not really, deal with it sensitively, there can be issues. So that was something that companies did talk about, that they really don't know how to go about it, because it's a very sensitive issue. It's a very volatile issue when you pick it up with in countries like India and all. Although you do have a lot of caste-related legislations in India, but this is a very sensitive and a very it's an issue to be handled with care. Right. They also talked, the companies talked about that they wanted to understand, wanted guidance on guidance on how do you raise these issues locally, right? In terms of, because it's sensitive, how do you raise it locally with the supply chain? So that is something, and what is it that you can expect from your local business or your, the local supply chain that you're talking about in that. So that was something. And the other thing was in terms of what is it that the companies could do to assist in addressing this issue in their supply chain. So that's something that, how is it that they could go about it in that. Some of the concerns that, people did come up with was that even Peter mentioned that, that employees are either caste blind, or they hide their castes in fear of retaliation or repercussions. So there is, on one hand, you have people who kind of say, oh, caste is not an issue, I don't believe in caste, or we don't believe in caste. And then at the same time, you do have people who hide for fear of repercussions or retaliations, or fear of their growth prospects being curtailed. So that is there. Then even in supply chain, some of the jobs which low caste workers do, like what Manjula talked about, the tanning work, or even when when in our training they did mention that that when you visit a company, there are certain tasks which are hidden, which you do not really see, which are normally done by low caste workers, and those are like and they are not, their vulnerability is not acknowledged, and it is not addressed in the whole HRDD processes of companies, right? And so that was one thing. And then they were interested in learning about existing guidelines and how do they address caste discrimination, making use of those. And then, so post the webinar, we got in the webinar we got an idea in terms of where are the gaps and what are the kind of issues and challenges which companies are wanting to address and wanting to understand more. And based on that, we kind of designed a training program where we looked in terms of converse, because they wanted to also understand the historical and the context of caste. Where, what it is, like, in terms of that. So we looked in terms of context of caste in South Asia as well as globally. We looked at how caste is affected in the workplace and in the supply chain. We looked at legal and policy frameworks which are existing both internationally and at national level in these countries for addressing work and descent-based discrimination at workplace. And then we talked about, if these are the things, if this is what it is, then what are the kind of available approaches, and what are the available mechanisms, or what are the kind of approaches or mechanisms that we can adopt to address caste discrimination in the workplace. It was a in-person training. We had 12 participants from 8 companies who came, and apparel and textile was with interest in supply chain from in India and Bangladesh. They were the major participants. Now, when we talk about, post the training, when we did an evaluation with the participants to understand where we, what is it, in terms of the effectiveness and the, what do you call, and the appropriateness or, the, of the training. And we looked at the relevance of the training. So it was like, most of the participants, they either strongly agreed or agreed that that this training was relevant to the work that they are doing in terms of relevant to themselves and to the work that they are doing in terms of supply chain, because they're basically looking in terms of addressing it in India and in Bangladesh. Even in terms of the whole content that was provided for dealing with it, they felt that most of the participants did feel that they do now feel equipped, but some of them are slightly more neutral because there is a need and requirement for understanding and probably handholding for dealing with and with this issue into their processes and mechanisms around that. So that was there, and but nobody kind of disagreed or with the whatever the training provided them with, the tools and other processes that they were provided. So this is something that they did feel like more the tools that we did provide in the training, they found it very useful. In terms of some of the learnings which the participants, these are some of the quotes from the participants. They said that these are some how would they use the training. So they said in terms of the remediation processes is where they would try and understand and kind of look in terms of implementing. In terms of they would use this for risk mapping with a caste lens now. So that's something that they would, and especially applying the discrimination check and see how it actually plays out into their supply chain and into the work. So that was something. Some of they also said that if we have, because we did use a case study approach, but we used a fictional case around that. But they said if we had probably used a real life case, they would have been able to relate it better, because in terms of what was the issue that came up, how was it addressed, and then what were the mechanisms and tools and other processes that were set up. So that was something that going forward, that's a learning for us in terms of what we would be doing that. They also talked about that they would be interested in looking in terms of the suppliers capacity training now, because that's something that but there was a concern that they don't want it to be to be a top-down kind of an approach in terms of because it's like the West telling them what to do. It's something that they are slightly wary of. So how do you kind of handle that aspect? So that's something that kind of needs to be done. And they said that they wanted specific trainings on how to have these conversations with the suppliers. Because when we talk about, it's something that they were wary of it being top down, so they would want to see how should they go about addressing it, or when they're approaching their suppliers in terms of that. Now, once we went through this whole process, we said, okay, what is the key learning for DSN UK, and what is it that we would like to take forward with companies in terms of, and with the partners in terms of, based on our 6-month engagement with companies and on this process. So we said that we could look in terms of, because the companies did show interest in terms of wanting to do it, but they still have their reservations in terms of how to go about it. So we are looking in terms of providing advisory support to businesses, in terms of, whether it could be in terms of, developing strategy which with the focus on, for their HRDD processes, with the focus on caste discrimination. In terms of, the redressal and complaint mechanisms, because people who are impacted by caste, because of fear of repercussions or fear of their complaints not being heard or things like that, so then they would not go through the whole process. So how would you develop those redressal and complaint mechanisms where people feel safe, a safe kind of an effective mechanism where these kind of issues do come up and people kind of address those. Then also looking in terms of developing, developing monitoring and evaluation mechanisms with companies, working with them in terms of, doing that, so that your redressal and complaint mechanisms are effective in terms of that. The other was, I mentioned as one of the learnings was about capacity building of businesses on approaching. So how, looking in terms of how do you implement the base code, the ETI base code guidance on caste and global supply chain, understanding of the discrimination check for businesses, how do you actually apply that in your businesses and others, so working with businesses around that. The other thing was, a lot of companies talked about was that they do have local NGOs who support them in some of their monitoring mechanisms and all. But some of the companies, a lot of organizations, they're either, they talk about marginalized, but they cast blind in one sense, right? So how do you make sure that Dalit organizations, so connecting companies to Dalit organizations so that this does not really go out of focus, and they kind of, work with Dalit organizations in terms of supporting and monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. So this is something basically in terms of, what we are looking in terms of working with companies based on some of our findings and our work in 6 months. So thank you.